Hey everyone, and welcome back to What's the Plan, the podcast where we dive into the matters of our careers in the architecture and urban planning field. I'm Hayley.
And I'm Andrea. So Hayley, what's the plan this week?
This week's plan is all about housing structures by residential building types.
So this is another In the Hotspot, where one of us will be put into the hotspot by answering questions on a specific topic that we want to explore.
These topics include concepts that one of us are unfamiliar with, giving us a chance to learn alongside our listeners as the host in the hotspot teaches us all about it.
So unlike previous editions of In the Hotspot, where there were one and done episodes, we thought we would have some fun and turn this topic of housing structures or buildings into a 3-part series.
Yeah, a 3-part series with a twist at the end.
Yeah, so the third part will be interesting, and we'll keep it as that for now.
And speaking of interesting, we decided to create a mini-series all about housing types because despite housing being an essential part of all our lives, we find that many of us actually lack knowledge or vocabulary to accurately describe it.
Yeah, 100%. A lot of times, styles get mixed up or, tenureship gets mixed up for, a building type.
Yeah.
So we'll get into all of it.
And without further ado, here is In the Hotspot Residential Building Types.
The word building means many things to different people. So, for example, for engineers, it can mean the process of constructing. For architects, it can mean the thing that we are constructing. So, off the bat, what do you mean by building?
So, with any policy, language and definitions are crucial in determining accuracy. And with that being said, it's important that I emphasize that depending on what municipality you're in, the definition of any term may differ.
Okay.
But for the purpose of our podcast, we're going to be looking at the City of Toronto. And so back to the question, as defined by the City of Toronto Zoning Bylaw 569, 2013, building means a wholly or partially enclosed structure with a roof supported by walls, columns, piers, or other structural systems.
Okay. Well, thank you for clarifying. I didn't realize the term could differ depending on where you live.
Yeah, right? It's definitely not something that the regular person would pay attention to. Even before I started reading into the different policy documents from different municipalities, I didn't realize how much of a difference it would make.
Yeah. Okay, so now that we've specified what we're going to talk about, what are the different types of residential buildings in the city?
Yeah, so in Toronto, there are 7 defined types of residential buildings, which includes apartment buildings, detached house, a duplex, a fourplex, a semi-detached house, a townhouse, and a triplex.
Okay. So, wow, that's a lot of different types.
Yeah.
But that's actually a lot less than I thought. It's nice to have nice defined numbers.
Yeah.
So, I want to say I have an idea of what, some of them are and what the differences are, but can you explain what each type is?
For sure, but hopefully once we actually get into it, it'll be easier to understand and digest.
Okay, let's start with the top of the list. What's an apartment building?
So an apartment building means a building that has 5 or more dwelling units with at least one dwelling unit entirely or partially above another. And each dwelling unit has a separate entrance directly from outside or through a common inside area.
Okay, so you said the term dwelling units several times. Could you explain in detail what that is?
Yes. Okay, thank you for asking that. So a dwelling unit is also a defined term in the bylaw, but in simple terms, it's a unit that includes a living accommodation and also has access to food preparation and sanitary facilities for anyone occupying the unit.
So to simplify that even more, it's they must have a kitchen and a bathroom.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Nice. So next, what is a detached house and how do it compare to semi-detached house?
So a detached house means a building that has one dwelling unit occupying the entire building, whereas a semi-detached house means a building that has 2 dwelling units that are not entirely or partially above one another. So typically, they're side to side.
Okay, so a detached house is what I guess most people would think an average suburban house is, with one entrance that has one nuclear family that lives in it, while a semi-detached house is, let's say, 2 families would live in it, and each family would have their own entrance and their own portion of the building.
Exactly, yeah. And so now a townhouse is a building that has 3 or more dwelling units where no unit is entirely or partially above one another. So similar to the semi-detached home, they're not above each other, they're right beside each other. But they have more than 2 dwelling units.
So is it fair to say that you can also call them row houses because they're like in a row next to each other?
Yes. So typically row houses and townhouses are seen as similar, but again, depending on what municipality you're in, terms may not exist. So for example, in the city of Toronto, the term row house doesn't exist. Yeah.
I see. Okay. So, okay, that makes sense. Okay. Now that the last few types you mentioned are types that we actually talked about in past episodes, in particularly the missing middle episodes.
Yeah.
But why don't we refresh your memory and go into what are duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes again.
Okay, so this is a little bit tricky, but once we break down the word, hopefully it'll be a little easier to understand. Okay. So first, let's break down the word into their respective parts. So each of those types of residential buildings has a prefix to the suffix plex.
There's a lot of X's there.
Yeah, so hopefully the more I talk about it, the more clear it becomes. Okay. But let me know by the end of the definition if it's still a little confusing. Okay. So, the prefixes do, tri, and for are as we think, meaning 2, 3, or 4, as they refer to the amount of dwelling units that are in the respective plexes. And so now, what is a plex? A plex is basically a residential building where there's at least one dwelling unit that is entirely or partially above one another. Okay.
So, if you have a unit above each other, is that similar to an apartment building, or how does that difference?
Good catch. It is. So, a plex is similar to an apartment building in the sense that the dwelling units are partially or entirely above each other. But in terms of the city of Toronto, residential buildings can only be classified as apartment buildings when there are at least 5 or more dwelling units, whereas the respective plexes would be 4 or less units, and that would, again, it would depend on whichever suffix is used. So a duplex would have 2 units, triplex would have 3 units, and a fourplex would have 4 units.
I see. So the term apartment building is sort of a catch-all for 5 and more.
Exactly, yes.
That makes sense. Okay, so now that we've talked about the various types of residential buildings, you did not talk about condominiums.
That's right.
Or condos for short. So just to clarify for all our listeners, condos are not a type of housing structure, correct?
Exactly. And that's actually a term that a lot of people get confused with. And I'm going to be honest, before I actually looked into it, before I actually got into development, I wouldn't know the difference.
Yeah, I only was introduced that there were differences by a prof of mine in university.
Exactly.
And, every time a lot of the students would, use those terms interchangeably, he would be very frustrated and always, scold us, saying, they're not the same.
Yeah, for sure.
So, if condos are not residential building types, what are they?
So, a condominium is actually a type of tenure, which is the condition in which the building is occupied. So basically, it's referring to the type of ownership. And with that being said, a condominium is when every occupant has ownership of their own unit, and the owners of the individual units also collectively own common areas of the overall property. So for example, in an apartment condominium, each dwelling unit owner also has part ownership over the hallways, elevators, any indoor amenity space, and any, let's say, outdoor landscaping. And now townhouse condominiums, which are becoming more and more popular, are similar in the sense that each dwelling unit owner also has part ownership over the portions of the townhouse that isn't individually owned.
Okay. So you mentioned that in apartment condominiums, they share hallways. Mm-hmm. So in townhouses, they don't have elevators or shared hallways. So what else could townhouse condo owners have part ownership of?
So townhouse condominiums are typically developed in the form of a subdivision. Okay. And so there are things like shared roads and possibly visitor parking spaces and, again, outdoor landscaping that would have shared ownership between dwelling unit owners.
Okay, so that makes sense. So how do we determine ownership of these shared spaces and amenities?
Condominiums usually determine ownership by way of condo fees, which, so that gets a little tricky.
Yeah, the thing that everyone complains about.
And so what these condo fees are is when unit owners would usually pay towards the property management that would then get redistributed into maintaining these spaces. So that is how each individual unit owner would still have shared ownership over these spaces because, again, they are paying into the maintenance of it.
Well, that makes sense why a lot of condo owners are very vocal about, like, their living spaces.
Yes,
or
exactly.
their shared spaces.
Exactly.
Yeah, so thank you very much for clarifying that.
Yes, of course.
I don't know about you, but it drives me absolutely bonkers nowadays when I, like, see people call any and all types of, like, high-rise living buildings, like, condos. Especially since the word, like, has taken a negative connotation nowadays.
Exactly, yes. Although, to be fair, we can't judge people for not knowing the difference when it isn't something that is so freely known about.
That's true.
But it's good that we're taking the time to educate everyone as much as we can, just to be clear.
Yeah. So now that we know about the various housing types of, can you give us some pros and cons of each type to help us identify which could be best for our needs?
For sure. So going back to the 7 residential building types that we talked about earlier, we talked about a few houses and also the apartment building, which the plexes kind of tie into. And so the way I think would best break down this section of the pros and cons would be to go through the 2 groups of residential building types. So first off, I think that the houses that we talked about, so the detached house, the semi-detached house, and the townhouse would have benefits for larger families or individuals who want a larger amount of space, because typically these houses take up more space and have more rooms available with it, whereas apartment buildings or these duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes have a more limited space and typically could have maybe 2 to 3 bedrooms as opposed to 2 to 3 bedrooms plus a living room plus a kitchen, which would be found in a home. And so depending on what your needs are, if you feel like you need that amount of space, a house of whether it's a detached, semi-detached, or a townhouse would probably suit your needs more. But if you don't find that space is what you need, then something like an apartment building, a duplex, triplex, or fourplex could suit your needs more.
So it looks like the hierarchy is like how much space do you want and how much space you want that is indoors versus outdoors, and then also I guess location.
Exactly. Another way to determine what the pros and cons are for you would be to see how close in proximity you want to be with your neighbors, because for example, with an apartment building or a duplex, triplex, or fourplex, your neighbors are right outside. You share a wall and common spaces with them, like we mentioned, the elevators, hallways, so there's no getting by without bumping into your neighbor potentially. So if you're someone that likes your own space, then looking into a house would probably suit your needs more as well.
Makes sense.
And so with all of that being said, Andrea, personally, what do you think would suit your needs the most and why?
Haven't gone through all of those different types of residential types. I think the one that might best suit me is an apartment.
Okay.
And particularly like a condo style apartment.
Right, so with your own ownership.
Yeah, with my own ownership, so I have my own place, but also at the same time I have a lot of amenities I can access at my fingertips within my building.
Right.
So then I don't have to for example, pay for a gym membership or join a recreational center to go to perhaps use a pool or all that kind of stuff.
Because that's what the condo fees cover.
Yeah, as well as having multi-purpose spaces that I could book out and use for my own I guess events or parties I would like to host. So I think as well as apartment buildings are typically located in within a more urban setting, so then you have walkable neighborhoods and access to perhaps transit really easily. So I think apartments would be for me.
Okay. Yeah.
What about you?
I think it would be very similar in the sense that I don't see myself needing a lot of space. So definitely an apartment building or some sort of plex would fit my needs the most.
Yeah, currently I think apartment, but perhaps in the future, depending where my life goes.
Exactly. We never know.
A plex would be nice as well.
But with that being said, learning about residential building types was the plan for now. Listen to our next episode to continue figuring it out with us.
Thanks for following along to this episode. If you liked it, please give us a like, review, and subscribe for more. Until then, follow us on Instagram at What's the Plan Podcast for what the next plan is.